In the course of what we call evolution, two processes, apparently contrary, are in continuous operation. One of these processes is called aggregation, and is represented to us by the tendency everywhere present in nature for things to unite or come together, or to be bound together by some common necessity. Aggregation is visible on the lowest levels of what we may term organic life. And we are aware of it in nature, in the communal existence of ants, in the herding instinct among animals, and in the union of bees, in the forming of their hives, and in their swarming. This process of aggregation applies also to the human being. The history of society has been largely a motion toward aggregation, from isolation to some common meeting ground, some general understanding. And the motives have not been so difficult, if somewhat more refined, than the motivations behind aggregation in the lower kingdoms. Human beings have united for protection, for the advancement of projects, for the defense of their ideas and their nations, and also for the creation of corporations, combines, and industries. Feeling that by this union there is an additional strength, and that in common cooperation we have the essential foundation of cultural advancement. The opposing so-called conflicting process is referred to as individuation. This is the inevitable emergence of the individual, the conspiracy of nature, continuously causing the strengthening of certain beings, creatures, or individuals, thus causing them to emerge from group patterns and to take their own particular and individual places in the history of society. The process of individuation is not essentially limited to the humankind, for we find it in the animal kingdom, where the herd has its leaders, where various groups cause to emerge from themselves certain outstanding examples of their own kind. And to these outstanding examples, the rest of the group gives a kind of allegiance, which may be instinctive, but is nevertheless real on a practical level. The concepts of aggregation and individuation have also developed into political theories among human beings. The aggregation concept has given us the socialized concept of living. It has emphasized communal or communistic institutions, and has as its principal slogan or keynote that the individual exists for the protection, improvement, and sustenance of the state. In other words, the individual is subordinated to the group. Within the broad pattern of this subordination, however, various degrees of individualistic activity can still be noted. And it is rare to find any socialized system which can actually totally ignore the exceptional individual. Their own actual processes of leadership, even within a socialized society, these processes demand the emergence of leadership material Therefore, the process of individuation must go on. The individual in an individualistic political system is considered to be the principal end of government. The state exists for the protection and advancement of the individual. And therefore, if one must be sacrificed to the other, the state must be sacrificed to the individual. Here again, however, we have no clear line of demarcation, for even the most individualistic systems demand organization, demand the integration of their policies, and must develop certain institutional methods by means of which they can enforce their rules or preserve the organization of their society. For this reason, the individual must resort to processes of aggregation in order to protect himself. These two systems have, as we say, existed since the beginning. Biologists, who perhaps approach this subject more intimately and more realistically than any other group, are firmly of the opinion that nature is conspiring ultimately to produce an individualistic society. That actually the end of all organization and group activity is to provide the individual with a continuous stimulation to the evolution of his own internal individuality. Therefore, biology cannot support a socialized state. Rather, it regards this as a means toward the continuance of individuality. Now, individuality, as applied to the human kingdom and to those fields of experience most familiar to us, is a word not too well understood and certainly not too carefully used. In the first place, an individuality implies a kind of separate uniqueness. It implies that the person is, by qualities, attributes, or characteristics, different. This difference may or may not imply superiority or the ascendancy of the individual over others of his kind. Usually, however, we think of it as a constructive uniqueness, a uniqueness of positive attainment or achievement. And we seldom use this term in a derogatory manner, although it so can be used. Actually, we are not certain that the term individual has a large, true, or enduring meaning. In order to assume that the individual is unique, that he is something cut apart from all of his kind, and is not only a unique creature, but has a continuing uniqueness, we must examine him rather more closely. We have no way of knowing, for example, that the term of individuality in the sense of mental personality has any more than a highly relative meaning. We are not sure that the individual today is the same person that he was yesterday. He looks very much the same. He acts very much the same. He has a continuing memory of his yesterdays. But is he the person who existed yesterday? Many individuals will fight definitely to preserve the fact that they are. But the individual who is the same yesterday, today, and forever is a doubtful blessing to himself and others. It is rather to be hoped that in the process of time from yesterday to today, something of a peculiar and definite nature has occurred, by which the individual has advanced, improved, or at least had one flitting thought that he never had before. As he himself is an aggregate, it is quite conceivable that this aggregation is forever changing. Therefore, that the term individual can be applied only at a given instant to a given complex of faculties, powers, attitudes, and other related psychochemical elements. If we assume that the individual is a continuing unfoldment, then we must assume that he is unfolding out of his own parts, arranging them into new patterns. These patterns are properly aggregates. Therefore, the individual himself is supported by the aggregates making up his own personality. He is not standing alone. He is standing, as Newton might have said, on the shoulders of giants. He is standing upon his own yesterdays. He is standing upon the elements of his own psychic organism. He is building with the aid of continually unfolding experiences, observations, and reflections. These are being processed through the parts of his own mental, emotional nature. Thus, instead of being one person, he is actually a number of persons focused together. And if something happens to this focal point, he may develop a mental peculiarity known as multiple personality, in which he loses control over the aggregate of his own parts. If man, therefore, be a rugged individual, it is because he rises from a group of related factors which make possible the emergence of his own peculiar personality. He therefore becomes a symbol or a demonstration of the results of the interior cooperation of his own parts. He is therefore a cooperative. And if some part of himself rebels against this cooperation, his total individuality is damaged, retarded, or at least fails to advance as it should. Recognizing, therefore, that a process of aggregation is continually occurring in man to make possible the appearance of individuality, we must then recognize the probability of the reversal of this procedure. A process of individuation is continuously taking place in the ego personality of the individual, which in turn, under normal conditions and properly directed, is contributing to the constant advance of the aggregate. Thus we have a benevolent cooperative set up. And this type of benevolence we see everywhere in nature, and it gives us the beginning of our realization that what we call the group and the individual are not inevitably locked in warfare, that they do not represent two irreconcilable opposites. Rather, they represent two parallel processes present in everything that exists, therefore essentially part of existence, and under the dominion of the same laws and principles which have decreed every other element of existence. If therefore nature has not voluntarily or intentionally created a confusion, but rather has used these two processes as means of advancing both the condition of the person and the condition of society, it becomes evident that we in our own turn should become adjusted to this, able to endure it, and recover from the mental confusion which misunderstanding has caused for a very long time. In the conflict which we most commonly recognize, we are inclined to think mostly of the negative sides of these polarized forces. When we speak disparagingly of the individual, we are thinking of a selfish, intolerant, and intolerable egoist, a person who would ruthlessly sacrifice others and, if necessary, his entire society to the advancement of his own ambitions. When we think of the collective or the group, we think of something sluggish, something too slow in its motions, retarding, holding back, and continuously threatening the individual and preventing him from having his normal self-expression and the privilege of growing according to the natural pace of his own nature and temperament. Nature does show us, and leaves us no doubt at this point, that the motion of the individual is usually more rapid than the motion of the aggregate. We know this everywhere. Remember Albert Hubbard said that a board of directors is a group of individuals that takes 10 times as long to do anything as one individual would take to do it by himself. This is true. There is what is called the static of mass. Things become heavy. Movement becomes difficult. And the innumerable processes of communication, by means of which ideas can be moved through groups in order to unite them in various processes, this procedure is slow. And the capacity of the aggregate is seldom equal to the capacity of its outstanding individuals. Thus, the individual may regard himself as burdened by the group. And from this position, he naturally seeks to escape, unless he has more cultivated motivations than those which dominate the average person. On the opposite side of this situation, we find that the aggregate is essential to nearly every process of the individual. If we were really completely free, it would mean that we are completely alone. Freedom, therefore, is not only freedom from what we do not like, but freedom from what we do like. In order to completely remove from ourselves the burden of the group, we must sacrifice also the natural benefits which have developed through the group over a long period of time. The person today would hardly be very happy to live in a society composed totally of isolated individuals. He would not like to feel, for example, that every phase of his daily life depended totally and entirely upon his own conduct and action. He would not like to see the public utilities fail. He would not like to have to go back to the day when he would carry water in a bucket from the nearest stream, wherever it was, and in our particular area it is dry 2/3 of the year. He would not like to feel that sanitation had ceased, or that transportation was no longer available. And he grumbles greatly when streetcars and buses are not duly and properly organized for his benefit. If he went on further through all the processes of life, eliminating everything that requires the power of group, in order that he may be freed from it, he would soon come to the ridiculous conclusion that his entire way of life was wrong, that he could not possibly endure, because he has gradually come to depend almost totally upon the group for his survival, for everything that he needs, everything that he wants. He also depends very largely upon the group for the stimulation of those processes in his own nature by which he is encouraged to be an individual. If you remove the group, the individual becomes comparatively non-existent. It is the old problem. If you are the only individual in the world, is there any individual? Because individual is a problem of contrast. It is a problem of relationship. Remove that which is not the individual, and the individual ceases to have meaning. We then concern ourselves a moment with the aggregate, or the group. We know that the aggregate is nearly always led or directed by concepts, by doctrines, by ideas, by opinions, beliefs, or by the actual machineries set up by individuals. We know that our religious aggregate today depends upon the great religious teachers and leaders that have gone before. We know that our commercial aggregates today depend upon a certain degree of specialized executive ability, without which these aggregates could not exist. And without these, in turn, our standards of living could not be maintained. So we have bound ourselves into a very intricate pattern. And out of this intricate pattern, there is a continuous alteration and alternation of emphasis. In some generations, it seems that the processes of individuation are reduced almost to nothing. We find this in areas under bondage or under strong dictatorial governmental systems in which the rights of the individual are reduced to nothing. We also find, however, that this process inevitably brings with it the revulsion or revolution of masses. We find the individual refusing to completely sacrifice his own nature. He rebels, even at the danger of his life. He gradually overthrows the dictatorial processes of aggregates. And when he has so liberated himself, he may in turn become a dictator and set up a new aggregate. It goes on and on and on. Today, the average person is not so much concerned with the historical phase of this subject, or its unfoldment on a sociological level, as he is concerned with its impact upon his own daily conduct. And here we have many different elements introducing themselves from a psychological and philosophical point of view. In the first place, what we term an individual is a unit possessing the interior perception or power of self-knowing. In other words, not self-understanding, but self-recognition. The individual is the creature capable of saying, I exist. And of saying this from a firm conviction and experience of self-existence. The individual knows that he exists. If he did not, he would not be able to proclaim his own existence. He knows also that he has certain powers, certain aptitudes and abilities, certain areas of influence, that he is capable of arranging himself in a number of patterns in relationships to other things, and that he is capable of the voluntary acceptance or rejection of ways of thinking and of ways of living. He therefore, in the terms of his own experience, has the unique possibility of experiencing self-being. Here is the root of a process of individuation that goes on continuously within him. Conversely, however, this same individual is incapable of experiencing the self-existence of another creature, any other creature. He may accept it. He may observe it. He may regard it as a philosophical truth or a scientific fact. But he experiences something about himself that he cannot experience about any other creature. He can say of another person, he is. But he says of himself, I am. This I am arises from factual experience. The statement, he is, arises from philosophic theory, originating in the testimony of the sensory perceptions. In his daily living, therefore, the individual divides the world into two distinct groups, that which is I, and that which is not I. And the group composed of I is a single or individual being. And the group composed of not I is an aggregate consisting of all other living things. Now, it would be rather obvious that the division is not exactly equal. But in the experience of the average person, it is more than equal, inasmuch as the experience of I within himself is more powerful and more important to him than the recognition of the existence of a not I in 2.5 billion other human beings. So most strong individuals take it quite for granted that in the conflict between themselves and all else, they have almost a certainty of winning. For the one that has the experience of selfness is stronger than all the others, about which this experience is not felt or known. Probably, in terms of sociology, the I self underestimates all other selves. Its primary underestimation resting in the fact that it does not regard these other selves from the same point of I vitality with which it regards itself. Nor does it actually realize that the so-called aggregate is composed entirely of units, each of which has the I experience in itself and the not I experience in relation to everything else. This makes quite a complicated pattern, which places every individual in the center of his own universe and gives the universe of larger values as many centers as there are individuals, and as vast a circumference as all individuals but one. This can be confusing, and in the course of life has proved to be extremely confusing. It would be bad enough if we had only to cope with the individuation process itself. If we only had to understand that each person is a self, and understand this so sincerely that it became a vital factor in conduct, this would be a large task in itself. But between us and all other persons are these masks, referred to as the personas. We wear a mask, for we do not reveal to others all that we think, all that we know, the full measure of our ambition, or the full strategy of our ulterior motivations. Likewise, each other person is behind a similar mask, so that within each individual is locked an intricate conspiracy of mental and emotional processes. These processes have caused us to become ever more fearful of each other, causing us to lose confidence in the common good of each other. And the same situation, because it is not solved and appears not to be solvable, creates the most dangerous of all relationships, and that is the relationship between self and mystery. We are mysterious to all others, and all others are mysterious to us. In the midst of this, we forget the supreme mystery of all, and that is that there is a subjective level on which we are also mysterious to ourselves. But we lose sight of this when faced with the tremendous evidence that we are surrounded environmentally by individuals whose conduct is unfathomable. Unfathomable conduct is like a hole in the dark, and as certain timid children are afraid to enter a darkened room, so many timid human beings are simply afraid of the darkness of the collective mystery of aggregates. A good example of that, perhaps, is the after-dinner speaker, who is frequently a most embarrassed man. I have seen persons who have been called upon to prepare a 5-minute address for the local Kiwanis Club, an address dealing with the possibility of instituting certain improvements in the valve and pipe industry. It was their industry. They knew about it. Of course, nobody else cared much about it, but at the same time, it was the thing on which they should have been quite fluent. This individual got up in front of the meeting of the club, which was a small neighborhood village club, and became absolutely petrified in the presence of a half a dozen of his own acquaintances. He had been asked to get up on his feet and speak to them, and he was in desperate need of an immediate enrollment in the Dale Carnegie course. He knew all these people. When he was sitting with them, they were his friends. When he stood up to speak to them, they were mystery. Utterly unsolvable mystery. They were weeping for him, urging him mentally with everything they had, trying to indicate that they were with him all the way. The harder they tried, the worse he got. He just could not face the necessity of even a few highly impersonal sentences. He was in the presence of total mystery. Trying to explain it afterwards, he just did not know what to say, except he sort of opinioned that these people probably knew so much more than he did. Perhaps he is trying to tell us that he was too egotistic to take a chance of exposing his own ignorance. Perhaps he didn't go that far, because if he thought for a moment, he would realize there was no one else in the place that knew anything about valves and pipe fittings except himself on that level. It was his business. They would cheerfully and were cheerfully paying him to do the thinking for them. But still he was afraid to get up and speak. This sudden relationship of the individual to the mass or to the group indicates the terrific limitation that is imposed by mental individuality. Each person is divided by his mind from the minds of others. And even when through communion and relationship, he has found various articulate means of communicating his thoughts and has been able to receive the communicated thoughts of others, the fear does not subside, for he is then in the presence of a secondary mystery. Are these other people telling the truth? Can he depend on them? Are they seeking ways to exploit and defraud him? And in this way of life, our means of communication have lost much of their vitality because we no longer trust them. And lacking faith in them, continue to live in private mystery. To overcome this problem, then, there are certain things we have to begin to do from a philosophical standpoint. And somewhere, this relates to nearly everyone. There are two bridges we have to cross. One is from individual to individual, and the other is from individual to group. The lesser of these mysteries, that of communicating with one person, has already proven extremely difficult. And we are forced to the final conclusion that communication depends upon a common level of understanding. Things too greatly separated in experience, tradition, belief, cannot arbitrarily be brought together by conversation, no matter how intelligent that conversation may be, or how anxious both persons are to achieve this communication. The capacity to communicate or to receive communication is part of the measure of individuality. Thus, individuality cannot be regarded as always providing understanding or interior vision capable of bridging intervals of isolation. In Eastern philosophy, this problem was met with perhaps the most ingenious solution that we have ever received. The Asiatic mind was not without practical experience. Eastern peoples had the same individuation processes and suffered from the same alternations between the individual and the aggregate. Therefore, their common awareness was not so different from our own. Western man, meeting the problem head-on, has produced the psychology that if you force hard enough, pound long enough, kick strongly enough, you will ultimately get your own way. That is one of the Western thoughts. That heroism means that we shall press on regardless of whether we are understood or not understood, and shall finally make a virtue out of being not understood or misunderstood. This in itself being assumed to be an inevitable and obvious example of superiority. In other words, if no one knows what we're talking about, this proves beyond doubt that we are intelligent. Now, this may satisfy us, but leaves the other person not quite convinced. Also, our general propaganda policy, the advertising of our ideas, the various ways in which we attempt to force common attitudes upon aggregates. We must indoctrinate them. We must sell them points of view. We must organize the attitudes, the interests, the appetites, the acquisitiveness, and the industry of aggregates as a means of maintaining our own financial equilibrium. The East has never been convinced that this will work, and the West has never been able to demonstrate that it does. We can prove that certain things seem to be accomplished, and just as we are most proud of them, they fall to pieces. We are not by any means in a position to indicate that the individual can save the aggregate by forcing his opinion upon it. Nor can he illuminate it. Nor can he cause it to experience identical with himself. The fact that he tells it may convince another person, but does not illuminate him to the state of personal participation in the fact. Therefore, we live by two codes, one of what we have experienced, and the other of what we are told to believe. And in emergencies, what we are told to believe fails to hold us. And we react again and again to that which we have experienced, which becomes the solid or not so solid foundation under our conclusions and actions. Eastern philosophy points out that the conflict between the individual and the aggregate depends upon this mystery factor, and that this mystery factor is from beginning to end a complete delusion. That the mystery with which we invest everyone else exists only in ourselves. In a strange way, we can experience other people. The moment we assume that these other people have experiences similar to ourselves. This we have trouble with, however. And it is especially troublesome if other persons reacting to their experiences cause things to come into existence which we either do not understand or for which we have dislike and prejudice. Gradually, out of conflict, arises a whole group of mechanisms that contribute definitely to psychological imbalance. Of course, fear is very largely the fear of the group. It is the fear of the self being placed in an absolutely dependent position upon the not-self. That things can happen to us that we can do nothing about. This is our fear. The fear that in our attempt to adjust to the group, that the group will not accept us, or that the group will not sustain us, or that we shall not find the congenial and happy associations we seek, these fears become very real. The fear of the group as critic, the fear of the group as adversary, as competitor, the fear of the group as a smothering restriction upon our own self-purposes, and the more common and ordinary fear that the group simply will not see things our way. All these disturb peace of mind. And because the group does not respond immediately, as it cannot, to every whim and instinct of our natures, gradually gives us sufficient evidence to justify the continuance and increase of suspicion, leading finally to the conviction that the group is against us, that we are poor castaways on a desert island, and that all that others exist for is to exploit us. This attitude can be demonstrated, but it is not good. And the individual who falls under it nearly always is weakened or destroyed, or his adjustments with society are perverted. It is actually demonstrable, however, that the group is composed of persons, mostly neither better nor worse than ourselves. And what we often refer to as a difficult person is really a problemed person, one who, unable to carry his own burdens with dignity, becomes conspicuous because he is not living as well as we think that he should. If we were able to recognize the number of mistakes we make in estimating others, we would be more tolerant toward the mistakes they make in estimating us. But this mystery of the group, the tremendous overshadowing mass of it, causes it to be a giant, an ogre, a monstrous thing, mindless and heartless, against which we must strive from the cradle to the grave. As we grow older, we are not so sure of our victory against this, and by degrees we allow it to close our lives, destroy our optimism, and cause us to take the feeling or belief that we are simply born to adversity, and that we may expect no fairness or benevolence from this strange, mysterious thing which we call the aggregate. The aggregate has no mind of its own, so we cannot take its part or position in our discussion. It is really nothing but a group of individuals, each feeling much as we do, but unable to find a common ground for the full expression of feeling without fear. Buddhism, which did a great deal with all of this type of problem, points out that man's relation to the aggregate must exist on a certain level of responsibility, that there are ties, that ethically the individual has no right to desert the aggregate. On the other hand, and from the opposing point of view, the aggregate must never be permitted to move in upon the individual to the destruction of his own existence. We think of the aggregate as something possessing tremendous cyclopean strength. Actually, it is distinguished, as all aggregates must be, for weakness rather than for strength. The things we do not like about others and society in general all grouped together to form a rather static pattern of adverse situations. Actually, the aggregate never moves in upon the individual beyond the point which he himself permits. One way to look at it, perhaps in a very practical way, if somewhat unpoetic, is that each member of the aggregate is so much concerned with himself that under normal conditions he gives very little heed or care to any other member of the aggregate. Really, we have to go out of our way to tangle with this situation. If we leave it alone, it will leave us alone. Except, of course, where we have responsibility. Now, philosophy defines the responsibility of the individual to the group, much in the terms of Plato's definition of the responsibility of rulers and ruled in a society. Where we are benefiting in common from mutual protective factors, or have a kind of society in which its success and continuance depends upon our common cooperative endeavors, we have responsibilities for self-maintenance, responsibilities to preserve the dignity and estate of the society to which we belong, responsibilities of law abidance, responsibilities of common support, by which we provide the advantages of a socialized existence for ourselves and others. These become all different kinds of taxes. And many of us are more taxed by the responsibility than we are by the money involved. In the case of organized living, it is the duty of the person to occupy a position in which it is not necessary for another or others to assume those duties which are proper to himself. Therefore, that they must not do those things which he should do, nor must he expect them to contribute to his laziness, his indolence, or his antisocial tendencies. So far, society is not, however, a great burden. The aggregate and man's relation to it in terms of his social, political responsibilities are in the type of world that we personally live in comparatively secondary problems. The individual can carry on his part in this plan without undue emotional involvement. In fact, he usually makes it impossible for him to carry on if he becomes too emotionally involved. If in the course of carrying on his various duties and responsibilities he develops antagonisms, he begins to resent the things he does. He begins to be unhappy because he is expected to cooperate. As soon as such emotions arise within him, his personal adjustments begin to break down. He does not destroy society, certainly not one individual will, but he begins to undermine himself and enters into a negative relationship with his own nature. The purpose of Eastern philosophy is to assist the individual to adjust to society without tension. And having relieved himself of tension, to permit, therefore, the experience of society to be a true process of individuation for him. In other words, his mingling with society advances him as an individual. The moment, however, resentments and antagonisms and suspicions dominate him, his own individuality ceases to advance. And instead of progress, we have danger of psychosis or mental disease. A healthy attitude toward other persons is a basic requirement for human sanity. Yet in our way of life as we know it today, this constructive relationship does not essentially exist. Certainly not in the lives of the majority of people. Suspicions and problems and antagonisms are increasing every day, and with them the peace of mind of the individual is decreasing. First then, in our thinking, let us forget or begin to destroy by a process of reason the significance of aggregates in the term of being oppressive masses or groups. We may have prejudices of all kinds. We have people who have strong religious prejudices, and the aggregate of their religious opponents constitutes a vast organization, and they are convinced that this organization is continuously conspiring against them. Thus we have religious war, which is one of the most difficult types of conflict, and which continues even in times of military peace, endangering our common understanding. And I have known many cases where individuals, claiming that they were the victims of subversive religious organizations, have started the very processes and campaigns of subversive activity themselves that they had blamed the other group for. It never occurred to them that they had no more right to oppress than they had a right to be oppressed, or that retaliation could do any good in a situation in which understanding alone could be solutional. Everywhere in nature we are striving for understanding as the means of reconciling all opposite factors or forces. Nearly all conflict is an artificial state which, if properly understood, resolves itself, and its natural cooperative elements are revealed. Practically all misunderstanding is simply downright lack of any understanding. And while it continues uncorrected, it will be the parent of innumerable tragedies in our way of life. Even as we suspect aggregates of the worst, we also falsely attribute to them powers by means of which they could accomplish great goods which we expect of them and which they do not fulfill. To expect more from aggregates than is reasonable is also to be disillusioned. The moment we allow our imagination to escape from common sense and fill the world around us with phantoms or with false evaluations of persons and occurrences, the moment we permit such things to happen, we begin to center upon ourselves dangerous situations and are likely to come under persecution complexes, which arise usually from the individual feeling that the world is against him, when in fact, usually, the world does not know that he exists. It is, of course, humiliating to assume that we are not sufficiently important for thousands of persons to go out of their way to persecute us. It is humiliating to think this, but it is more difficult and more dangerous not to be able to attain this humility and to realize how dangerous it is to all of us when these manias are permitted to develop. For out of them ultimately come these perverted individuals, supported by the mania of masses and their own, such as we have suffered from so keenly even in the present century. So everything possible must be done to prevent false values and delusions to arise in the relationships of individuals. If you have been slowly convincing yourself that you're having a hard life, and a number of persons are doing magnificently in this procedure, it is time to pause and begin asking ourselves some very pertinent questions. If we will examine into this hard life, one of two factors will nearly always appear. One of these is that we are deficient in a sense of humor. We are taking ourselves much too seriously. Also, we have the wrong kind of memory. We have a memory that remembers the wrong things and conveniently forgets certain other things. There is no life in which there has not been redeeming and beautifying adventures. If, however, we ignore these, or gradually permit them to cease to be important under the rising addiction to self-pity, we shall look forward to long years of misery and sorrow. These misfortunes we will blame upon the mystery inhabiting the not-self, all these things around us. Our relatives, our friends, our enemies, the state of the nation, the state of the world. All these will be our excuses for our misery. It is possible, and I have known cases, where individuals really had a pretty rough time of it. But in most instances, those were not the people who were the most miserable. The individual who really is miserable is the one who, when you ask him what is the cause of his misery, cannot even think up a good answer. He's just miserable. He can't even remember what about. He cannot actually defend his own position. When he starts to put into words the things that make him miserable, they are so trivial that he cannot listen to them himself with satisfaction. One individual got through with one of these discussions and finally looked at me with a kind of a sickly grin. Sounds pretty stupid, doesn't it? It is. But when you keep it locked inside, it becomes the basis of a general embitterment. The sense of humor and the recognition of values in various levels will help us immensely. Also, the wonderful ability to permit things to move through us without meeting too many hard barriers, and ourselves able to move through things without becoming too greatly involved in them. These are most helpful means of preventing tension. The individual can stand a tremendous amount of stress if he doesn't brace himself for it. It is much like judo. The world becomes a wall to those who strike out against a wall. To To the person who builds adamantine barriers in his own thinking, the world becomes a prison. But if he does not build barriers himself, he does not find them in space. Nearly every situation that the individual blames upon the aggregate arises within himself, and the aggregate is only a mirror or reflecting surface upon which the person sees his own disposition, nature, or personality. Instead, therefore, of being a hole in the dark, the aggregate is a mirrored surface. What the aggregate really is, we do not know, and we do not really want to know most of the time. What we see in it is simply the reflection of our own motives, for we attribute to others the motives that are in ourselves. We assume that they will act according to our own subconscious instincts. Now, many persons will deny this. They will say that it is quite possible to bestow better motives upon the reflection than we will ever find there, and that the person looking out into the mirror and seeing something better than it is will then be deceived, will trust the wrong people, and out of trusting and faith will come into further unfortunate relationships with other people. This is an exaggeration, but again, you almost feel that you can prove it. It gets to be a pretty obvious thing that can be defended with skill, if not with fact. The true problem here is that when you look into the mirror and think you see something better than yourself, what are you seeing? Are you seeing something that looks more like a reflection of little Eva from Uncle Tom's Cabin? Are you looking into the flat face of innocence? Are you looking into something in which you have a certain saccharine quality but very little real vitality? Are we making other people better? Or is our concept of what is better rather poor and vacant? If we assume that other people are better than they are, making this considered to be benevolent mistake, what are we actually saying? We are actually only saying in another way that we have no idea what they are. And we are just as much in danger when we attribute them with good motives that we cannot justify, as we are in when we attribute to them bad motives which we cannot justify. The individual who is perpetually deceived and exploited is not being deceived and exploited because he is good. He is being deceived and exploited because he is stupid. Let's face the fact. Now, kind-heartedness without intelligence is not good, any more than it is good to spoil a child, simply because we care for that child. Nor is it true that the person who goes through life being continuously deceived is deceived because he is such a lovable character. He is deceived because he doesn't know enough not to be deceived. He is deceived because he does not have either the individual power to withstand the deceit or the sense of common group responsibility, which would cause him to regard his own gullibility as the cause of temptation to other people. The man who leaves his door open is party to the crime of being robbed, because he has given an opportunity which was more of a temptation than someone else could withstand. Therefore, we are contributing to his delinquency. This problem, then, of being perpetually deceived must be picked up somewhere along the line and rationalized. Somewhere into it must be inserted the hard facts of common sense. It is perfectly right for us to look for the good in all, but it is not right for us simply to permit ourselves to be the victims of the machinations of other people on the ground that such is a virtuous way of life. The virtuous way of life is one in which we neither deceive nor are deceived, because by our natural understanding we protect ourselves against the temptations to injure others, and we are able to recognize the symptoms of those who might be tempted to injure us. If we face the matter very frankly and very honestly and very directly, we will find that many of our great tragedies melt away because they arise from various forms of weakness, indecision, and lack of basic value in our own relationships to this mystery called the group. We have a right to be responsible for our part in group activity. We also have a right to expect and to require that other persons involved in a group shall also fulfill their natural duties. And where for any reason we are inclined to suspect that this is not the case, we have a right to withdraw our own cooperation from such persons until they mend their ways. We do not hurt them, we do not injure them, we do not fight with them. We simply cease to cooperate with that which we do not believe to be true. We can be wrong, and in some instances we will make mistakes, but we will make fewer mistakes, and we will also have greater emotional stability upon which to base judgment. The moment we become involved in situations that get out of hand, our power to judge is undermined, confusion sets in, and we make one wrong decision after another. Under these conditions, it is far more advisable to get a separate look at the situation, to step back, view it in perspective, and move only according to the best judgment that we know. And most people who move by their best judgment move rather well. More people fail to use their own best judgment than those who suffer from it by a very great percentage. From philosophy, then, we come to the simple conclusion that the conflict which exists between us and groups or societies or social systems resolve finally to a few rather frustrating particulars. And about these frustrations, we also have to do a little thinking. Perhaps one of the great weaknesses of our way of life at the present time is its frustration upon the individual's effort to cooperate for the common good. It appears constantly that every effort by which we might be able to make a valid contribution to a larger pattern of things is blocked. We are forced back upon ourselves and upon private living and private industry for our satisfactions. In all probability, this subtly is part of the education to which we must all in time direct our attention. One of the most common forms of mental imbalance and a very prevalent mania is this tendency to move from an unsolved personal life to the larger challenge of an unsolved universal society. The average person is much more interested in making the big contribution which he cannot make than he is in making the small contribution that he can make. And one of the difficulties, as has been pointed out for centuries with most reformers, is that they forgot to reform themselves. Our natural desire is to gain a larger theater of action. And this desire is prevalent today. Perhaps it is just as well if we are thrown back on our own haunches in this particular. With 50% of our people in various phases and degrees of extreme mental or emotional tension, we have a tremendous proof that the average person today is unadjusted. Much of our sickness arises no longer from the old contagions that we once knew, recognized, but from subtle causes within our own psychic lives. The average person is not happy, not adjusted, not reasonably content, not patient under responsibility. He is rather in a condition of continual rebellion. For this type of individual to emerge too rapidly into positions of leadership would be a very mixed blessing, if any blessing at all. Our first problem, which nature has always pressed upon us, is victory over the inconsistencies and inconstancies of our own mental emotional lives. Before then, we think of the grand contribution. It is very important that we realize that we are not really capable of this grand contribution. If the patterns and plans which most of us have developed within us and which we feel the whole world is waiting to receive were actually put into effect, we would be in a pretty bad spot. There is too much good-heartedness, too much willingness, too much eagerness, and even dedication without understanding, without the sobering experiences by means of which we have to actually move worlds when the time comes. So in this emergency, in which very few people are able, apparently, to do the big things that they want to do, we have an interlude in which we can be greatly industrious doing the small things that desperately need doing. And these small things center around our own conduct, our own attitudes, and our own relationships with those responsibilities and persons with whom we have been brought by life into a more or less direct and immediate relationship. I like always to feel that our Eastern philosophers have a certain answer which we do not have, and that is the gradual development of a composed relationship with life. Now, we hear all kinds of arguments about this. The moment you start to talk about the Western man about being integrated and composed, he thinks you mean that he is supposed to lie down and die. He has lived so long under tension that he considers relaxation as a form of sickness. If he is not constantly on the edge of a nervous breakdown, he feels that he has lost his grip. Actually, integration is not negative. The individual who gradually organizes his own life and gains control of his own internals is achieving the most difficult and arduous task in the whole world. It is right to say that the man who conquereth himself is greater than he who taketh a city. and even the world's great conquerors, Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, who laid whole empires waste, and built also laws to change the course of history for 1,000 years, these individuals died of their own lack of self-control. They were never able to achieve conquest over self. Because of this, they are differentiated from those true heroes whom the world recognizes, respects, and venerates, most of them simple and humble persons, unknown or little known in their own time, persecuted perhaps and martyred, but gradually remembered as the living demonstrations of the power, the eternal power of interior adjustment with truth, which alone is valid and alone is important. Now, we cannot ask every person to attempt some heroic measure even in his own life, but there is certainly much to be gained, and much peace of mind, and much tranquility of life to be earned through a simple effort to turn the attention from the faults of others and our desperate instinct to change other people, or to batter ourselves against the invisible wall of the mass, to turn from this arduous and probably impossible pursuit and begin a more persuasive way of expanding our sphere of influence. Socrates was a comparatively humble man, yet this man has moved the world for 2,400 years, for contributing an immense amount of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, which have been preserved and which have made their contribution to nearly every successful, ethical, cultural program that followed after the time of Socrates. He achieved a certain organization of his own life, a very simple organization, and taught by the most powerful instrument man possesses, example. Far more eloquent than words, more persuasive than argument. And in this, each person has a way to solve the immediate situations in which he finds himself. Not that he shall bend, bow, and break, but rather that he shall search for values, and by seeking them and discovering them, find stability, find a certain immovability, in which it is no longer necessary for him to lean upon the group and become totally enmeshed in every moving fad and fashion which can afflict and burden individuals who have failed in their own individuation. Starting with the conflict between ourselves and others, we then cease this conflict, always remembering that it requires two to cause a conflict, and that if one person will not conflict, then the entire conflict becomes an ignominious failure. If we can separate our own lives from this instinctive resentment reflex, we can do a great deal to make things simpler and more pleasant. But how? We know that these transformations are indicated and necessary, but each in his own way runs against the almost impossible situation of trying to achieve them. Perhaps Confucius was one of the wisest thinkers on this particular detail that the world has ever known. He warned his disciples and all who would listen against the individual who arms himself to fight against his own faults, that this is not the way in which it is done. Faults are like small children. The more you notice them, the more precocious they become. And as soon as they discover that they can annoy you, you are lost. Under the pressure of such childish misbehavior, the more thoughtful adult finds that it is not wise to dramatize his child's condition, either to himself or to the child. And when the child is most bidding for attention, perhaps it is wisest to give it the least notice. The same is true of our faults. If we go head on into them, we head into another mystery, the darkness of our own interiors. We do not know how big the faults really are. Perhaps they're like icebergs, only 10% visible and the other 90% a mass of submerged problem, which we might have to struggle with for a century if we live that long. Going in to examine our own faults, we can be just as wrong in estimation as we are in estimating other people's. Thus we must use a more strategic method. Confucius says, just don't disturb your faults. Leave them the way they are. Just let them sit there and you walk away and leave them. Don't argue with them. They may be able to tell a better story than you can. You argue with them, they may convert you, which is the very thing you do not want. But instead of making a conflict around them, or a head-on attack, try a more subtle mechanism. Confucius pointed out that when an individual is living on a certain level, it means that this is the aggregation of his parts. Each part of his own nature is making a contribution, and the sum of that contribution is the adequate or inadequate person that he is. The main thing is to change this chemistry, to get at this internal, remembering that if you take one tiny electron out of an element, you change the whole element. Whereas if you pound on it from the outside forever, you probably would have very great difficulty in changing it at all. If in a pattern of the personality, one factor is changed, perhaps a factor remote from the faults under consideration and apparently with no bearing on them, if any part of the human being becomes in any way better, his entire individuality is altered. His relationship to everything is changed if he changes his relationship to anything. This is a very Chinese bit of logic, coming from a subtle people who have learned that one way to train the young is to get away from their faults and simply instill new virtues that apparently do not conflict with those faults, and therefore never bring the personality head-on into a clash with itself. Today, if we do that too often and too industriously, we'll probably end up with a complete fatigue mechanism. And nothing will change. The stubborn man with his faults will be as stubborn as ever. He is stubborn because he is defending the action of himself with the part of himself which performed the action. And you are not going to get anywhere with that. Confucius said, all right, let's forget that you have a rather poor disposition. Let us forget that you are selfish, egotistic, a little tyrannical. Let's leave that all alone and I will teach you to play the violin. Or perhaps we will forget that you are a petty thief, or that you are a forger, or a blackmailer. Let us go out together, and I will teach you to ride horses. This was the way Confucius approached the thing. He was convinced that if a man learned to ride a horse well, and Confucius was a great horseman, he would suddenly come into a kind of self-esteem out of achievement. And he couldn't live with that self-esteem unless he lived up to it. And first thing you know, some other fault began to slip away because it defamed or defaced his new standard of his own attainment. He made the decision, nobody else did. Or the man who learned to play the violin gradually became convinced of certain principles of harmony and of beauty. Learning to know the world as a great orchestration of values, he subconsciously and without realizing it began to enjoy creativity. He began to enjoy creating music. And when an individual creates, and he can hear what he creates, he knows whether it be sweet or sour. And in learning to create something that is beautiful, he found a kind of satisfaction which he wished to continue to enjoy. This dissatisfaction, running contrary to some previous conduct of his own, caused him to neglect his old conduct and cling to his new satisfaction, because it was real and immediate. And in the course of time, his temper bettered, or his disposition relaxed. He had not been told to do anything about his character. He was just told to grow in some way. And nearly everyone with reasonable mentality can convince himself that he would like to grow in some way. Even his most selfish instinct would make him wish to be superior. And in his desire to be superior, he will do those things finally which will contribute to this. But he will not do it over the dead bodies of his own beliefs and opinions. Leave these alone and let him build. Remember that it is not good, as Confucius points out, for an individual to have a great virtue with which he goes out fighting a great vice. This kind of single combat is more like medieval tournament and frequently ended in the wrong person winning. It is much better to float the entire life upon a rising level of general appreciation of value. Let the person become better educated. Let him say to himself, I'm not able to be very happy with my own company, therefore I will put myself to work at something. I will go and learn a language. I will study an art. I will investigate some trade or profession. I will develop some skill. I will take an interest in some form of mental or emotional creativity and expression. By so doing, the life becomes occupied with other values. Now, nature and society has played a good and kindly trick upon us by forcing us to divide our attention between our own feelings and the need for our economic survival. It gives most persons a job which they cannot neglect without endangering survival. If they quit the job, they cannot eat. And as hunger is still one of the principal inducements behind human activity, men stay to their job. Yet this job is much more. It is actually the only discipline they have. It is the only thing they have to do. Therefore, the only part of their lives in which there is some kind of orderly and sequential procedure. The tendency or desire to escape from this order is frequent, but nature keeps us more or less on the job in one way or another through the productive years of life. This creates habit, and habit protects us even after productivity ceases. It is perfectly possible, however, to take the person who is, we'll say, emotionally depressed, the individual who perhaps has had heartaches and heartbreaks, and give this person a new way to live, not by telling them how to meet a heartbreak with greater fortitude, or to simply retire into prayer, or to carry the load. All of these things may be partly necessary, but more is necessary. And that something more is the re-chemicalizing of their personality through the introduction in a manner that does not appear to be pressing or conflicting of this type of larger interest. This does not mean that they must take up some philanthropy or do some vast, idealistic, unselfish thing. It simply means to know more than we know in anything. The moment our knowledge of any subject, from the previously mentioned pipes and valves up and down, the moment this knowledge increases, something happens to us in the terms of the individuality focus. The moment there is a major change, of course, the whole individuality likewise changes. We hear people say sometimes, referring to an individual in whom an extraordinary change has been apparent, "My, he's a different person." Never saw such a change in anyone. And things like that. These changes cannot usually be traced directly to a conflict between the individual and his problem. They are changes brought about sometimes apparently by the most trivial accidents. Meeting a person who has a special way of explaining something, looking at a great work of art, retiring as Thoreau did to the little pond at Walden for a couple of years. Travel, bringing us suddenly into the face of how other people actually think and live. People we have previously known only out of books, and about whom we may have had grave prejudices. The sudden discovery that we had a prejudice and that we were wrong about something may open the door to our recognition that we could be wrong about other things. I know one case in which a very staunch, very reactionary fundamentalist, who really was dyed in the wool and threatened to die there, this individual went to a comparatively primitive country for the purpose of saving it. He was there only 4 or 5 weeks when he came home very quietly and decided that it did not need saving, which was the biggest discovery he ever made in life. From that time on, he was a changed man. He had a spirit of broadness born in him through this experience that made 2 generations of his descendants a lot happier. He was a changed person. And yet you could have argued with him and talked with him forever, and he would have considered it heresy to change one of his fundamentalist attitudes. But in the face of actual experience, there was enough honor and integrity in the man. He had to change. He had to accept what he could see and what he could know as factual experience. Any of these circumstances, then, will help to break up these complex patterns. And as individuation is this procedure by which each day a new focal point is attained, we recover from our problems by permitting each focal point to be a little better than the one the day before. If we can accomplish this, if we can add one tiny fragment to our comprehension, we are part way out of our trouble. The danger, of course, is that we become so locked in the old pattern that we cannot change at all. But this is not usually complete lockage. If you take people and put them under various tests, you will find that there is a crack in the omelet of everyone. It has been observed in prisons that what appears to be a completely hopeless and hardened criminal, one who is guilty of practically every crime recorded in the book, is still not completely bad. That there is something there that can be and sometimes is touched and causes a tremendous change. This is not done, however, through cuddling the criminal. It is done through a planned understanding of what may be possible and a truly rational and analytical method of searching out that particular area and trying to stimulate it into greater activity. There is a scientific means of doing these things, and being helpful is a kind of science, and unless it is approached scientifically, it can be a mass of bungling. To find this in ourselves is usually not too hard, because most people feel quite convinced that if they looked inside themselves, they would find innumerable virtues just waiting to bud and blossom, but limited by some little circumstance that must be corrected. So all we generally need to blossom is that somebody else will understand us or will stop misunderstanding us. Well, if all else fails and no one comes forth, we can work it out among ourselves. We can start to understand and stop misunderstanding ourselves. In doing this, we probably can find ways out. But like the alcoholic, we are intimidated. We simply turn to counselors and we say, I know these things should be done, but I cannot do them. I try, but something is lacking. There is lack of energy, lack of available willpower, a lack of resource by which I can stick to a remedial program. The individual just feels he's not capable of being or living in constant conflict with the mistakes in his own nature. It's just too much for him. Well, he can't be any worse off than he is because he's living with them now. Therefore, he can just simply leave them alone. They can do no more harm to him than they are doing. And if he gets his mind off of them entirely, they will immediately do him less harm. But this doesn't mean that we should permit other people to go out and steal because they have been stealing. It doesn't mean that we should continue to steal because we have been stealing. It means rather that in the level and range of our emotional confusions and mental processes, we are working with a more subtle form of crime. The average individual seeking psychological help is not a physical criminal. He is a psychological criminal, guilty of the misdemeanor of injuring himself. And in this relationship, it is not necessary for him to keep his eye on the misdemeanor continuously. It is much better for him to get his heart and mind away from that sensitive field and into this process of building a new way of value in his own consciousness. Most persons can also do it with considerable painlessness. You can go so far as to achieve a great deal without any actual conscious effort of your own. This more or less approaches Zen and your Buddhistic attitude. If you are too weak and too feeble to make any strenuous effort, then expose yourself to the subconscious power of your own mind and proceed to create patterns around you which can move in upon you and produce some of the results that you desire. Instead of seeing the world around you as something to reflect your disasters, set up the scenery in this world around you whereby it can bear witness or can support some essential progress for yourself. If you are not strong enough to fight a bad disposition, you may be able to keep a small plant alive in your room. You can perhaps find sufficient energy to work for a few moments in a garden, or work with paint or pencil and try to sketch something beautiful. If this is too arduous, secure an object that is reminiscent to you of everything that is beautiful and fine, put it where you can see it and live with it. Even this will begin to civilize you inside yourself, if a bit of the barbarian remains, and it's usually there somewhere. This is the ministry of art. This is why, to persons in dilemma, art is more important than bread. We all have enough bread, or nearly enough, or we never have as much as we want. And we are now more interested in cake than they were during the French Revolution. But to man's survival, beauty is more important sometimes than any other so-called luxury which the individual can possess. We know, for example, today, that if you have a picture on the wall of your room, and you turn out every light, and the room is pitch dark, and you lie in bed, and you go to sleep, and you are unaware that you exist, that picture is still influencing your mind. Not only that, but in your complete state of sleep, you can see that picture. And this experiment has been proven, and not under mediumistic or psychic situations either. It has been proven that if anyone came in while you were asleep and defaced that picture, you could know it, even though the room be dark and you could not even see it. Man has faculties that apperceive or apprehend without his knowing it. And these faculties are continually supplying his subconscious and unconscious minds with stimuli. Stimuli that completely bypass his conscious functions. Therefore, he is capable of being indoctrinated by things that he never actually consciously knows that he sees. He is indoctrinated by the picture behind him that he never faces and has never seen. Because just as surely as his ESP range permits him to identify cards in a deck, there is something in him that can see that picture if it needs to. This we have trouble in believing, but it's part particularly of the Shingon sect of Buddhism. It is part of the conviction that man is continuously nourished by the things around him, and that his disposition can be profoundly affected if he scientifically orders his environment, presuming that he has no strength available for any powerful action of his own. If he has strength enough to put beauty into the house he lives in, or to add certain harmony and distinction to the room in which he lives, making sure that it is not discordant, that it has some taste, that it is a kind of mirror which can reflect something good from within himself, that even this will change his life. That every time he makes a positive move toward self-improvement, feeble though it may be, it moves in upon the whole compound of his mistakes and his failings. It would be very hard to root out all of man's faults, because they are like the sowing of the dragon's teeth. As fast as they are sown, they rise up as soldiers and go to war. It is far better not to attempt this battling with our faults one by one, regretting, bemoaning. It is better to begin the integration of a new relationship with environment. By so doing, ultimately, the not-self, which is everything but the self. The not-self is your neighbor, your community, and the four walls of your own room. Your not-self is the car you drive, the clothes you wear, the radio, television programs that you tune in. Your not-self is the motion picture you go to see, the opera, the play. These are all your not-self. Yet every one of these factors can apply to yourself. And if you begin to cultivate discrimination in that which surrounds you, you will find increasing capacity within yourself to control attitudes, habits, or practices which you regard as objectionable. It is a subtle way of going about it, but time has proven that it will work. That there is a way in which we can reintegrate the individuality which we possess so that it becomes increasingly harmless and of greater satisfaction to us. Gradually we observe also an instinctive and inevitable tendency to release or reverse our attitude when in the presence of certain things. The individual in the presence, we will say, of great art or music, suddenly ceases his aggressive belligerence toward life. He does not listen with the same belligerence with which he normally attempts to meet problems. Listening is a receptivity. To gaze upon something beautiful is to be moved, to permit it to move you. It moves in upon you, so does music. These things moving into you must be accepted, not with conflict, but with a certain poise, relaxation, and almost gratitude. We then find a more healthful and normal cultivation of our faculties when we realize that these faculties are created in part at least in order that we may be grateful. That these faculties are not merely defensive and offensive instruments, they are gracious instruments of acceptance. That through them we can receive into ourselves almost anything that we are willing and able to accept by our own attitudes. If we accept the wrong things, it is because our attitudes are wrong. By degrees, then, the problem of environment and things around us ceases to be so difficult. The individual and the group come into closer harmony. We become aware of our natural appreciation for the works of others. This group that we look out upon includes all others who have lived at any time. Buddha, Confucius, and Jesus Christ are part of that group. They are forces moving into us from the collective. They are the not-self influencing us. They are the thing which we are aware of as not I, but as something else. If we fight this collective continuously, we are opposing ourselves to its lower strata, the strata of difficult emotions. If, however, we take a different attitude in our own natures, we can adjust ourselves to the majesty of the mass, the majesty of the group. For in this majesty is Copernicus, Newton, Gutenberg, Dante, Virgil, Plato, Pythagoras. They also move in upon us. They are part of this mysterious thing which we call the aggregation. They are everything but ourselves affecting us. Why then must we be affected only by the worst of this aggregation? Why not recognize that by discrimination we can gain joy, wealth, and serenity from the same sources from which we now extract pain and suffering? If we lock ourselves against the aggregation, we lock ourselves against the wisdom of the ages, and we do this to save ourselves a little pain. Yet we need neither lock ourselves nor have the pain. Through the proper adjustment of our own individuality, so that we can permit our inner receptivity to function normally, we can not only serve the group, but we can accept the magnificent heritage of the group. And we shall perceive, as biologists perceive at the end, that the group and the individual really are other names for the same thing. For every individual is a group, every group is an individual, every individual is composed of group parts, and every group is made up of individuals. In this, then, we have only psychological difference, a psychological difference causing fear and discord. And by psychological education, we change this, so that it becomes not difference, but recognition of similarity, and we become mutually enriched by things that once seemed to offend or disturb us. Thus we can reconcile these opposites as we can all other opposites in nature. Time is up.